Hey, everybody, and welcome to Twice as Lively with Ken Heckenlively. It is 1 o'clock on the Pacific Coast, but it is Sunday. So that means if you have some alcohol in your beverage of choice, it's socially acceptable. It is not a faux pas because it is Sunday, which means you could have had a mimosa for your Sunday brunch, and that would make all alcohol consumption acceptable in a social setting. But there is no alcohol in my Pete's coffee. There is only a cafe Americano with some milk and honey because I'm a sweet guy. And I'm going to be talking about another sweet guy, JD Vance, today. But before we get there, let's do our simultaneous sip. Get ready with your adult beverage of choice. Today, it can have alcohol, as I remind you. So get ready. Here we go. That simultaneous sip, which is oh so good. We love our Pete's Coffee. Now, I remind you that Pete's Coffee is not a sponsor of this program, but they probably should be because I love Pete's Coffee. And don't we always want to have coffee and conversation with our family, neighbors, and friends? Because that's what genuinely makes life worth living. Okay, today's episode, JD Vance, the all tool player. What do I mean by an all tool player? Well, it's an expression from baseball, which I'm not that familiar with, but as I best understand it, an all tool player is somebody who is good at fielding, running, and hitting, a kind of all star. And that's really what I believe JD Vance is in this administration. And you may be overlooking JD Vance in this administration, but I encourage you, do not overlook him. Do not overlook him because Trump is such a force of nature, as is some of the other members of the administration, like Marco Rubio, who seems to be killing it as Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth at Secretary of War, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Human Health. All of these are also all-star players. But I encourage you to take a closer look at JD Vance. And in particular, I encourage you to look at his 3-hour epic interview with Joe Rogan. This is the broadcast which convinced me that JD Vance is a superstar. Okay. And you may not get this right now, which is why you turn in and listen to me, because I will pick out the things that you might miss, but will become clear over time. Now, I've heard JD Vance talk a couple times and I've been impressed with him, but in 3 hours, you really get a sense of who somebody is. So let me just set it up for you. 3 hours. You're going to spend 3 hours with somebody just talking. What comes across with JD Vance in those 3 hours? He is smart. Now, you can be too smart and turn people off, but not JD Vance. He's relatable. He will make some common mistakes that normal people make, and yet those mistakes will make you think he's a regular guy. He's approachable. He will interact with you. He will show respect. I got to tell you, I'm so impressed by JD Vance, and you will be too when I go through all of the various subjects that he covered in his interview with Joe Rogan, and also how much JD Vance affected Joe Rogan. So remember, Joe Rogan, the most popular podcaster out there. I submit to you that Joe Rogan has fallen under the JD Vance spell. And at the end of this broadcast, I'll tell you exactly how I know that. So let's go through the 3-hour interview. What did they start talking about at the beginning? Well, Joe Rogan is a master at getting people comfortable. So he does that by first starting with non-controversial subjects, things that he knows are going to get a warm response from his guests. So what did they start talking about? They started talking about the recent fight night at the White House, creation of the Octagon. If you know that story, what happened was there was a big storm, it got delayed, but then it eventually happened and it was just a great night, okay? So they bond over that. And then Joe Rogan moves into the question of mail-in ballots, which Joe Rogan expresses his belief, which he knows that JD Vance will also agree with, which is that unless there are extreme circumstances, illness, somebody serving in the military overseas, you probably should not have mail-in ballots. You should not send mail-in ballots to every single person on the voter rolls. So that was great. Then they started having a little bit of fun. So now Joe has broached two subjects with which to get JD Vance sort of loosened up. And that's wonderful. And now JD Vance can tell some stories. So he tells a story about the recent 2024 presidential election and how crazy it was that Kamala Harris said that she was in favor of taxpayer-funded sex changes for illegal immigrants. So it's a nice way to bond. They're both, talking about how stupid this is. So notice now what Joe Rogan has done. He's covered 3 topics. Each one is likely to elicit a positive response from JD Vance, and JD Vance brings it. Then what Rogan does is he moves into a controversial area. He starts talking about the effort, especially in the state of Texas, to put the 10 Commandments up in schools. And specifically what Joe Rogan raises is, let's say I'm Hindu and I'm seeing the 10 Commandments from the Jewish faith and the Christian faith up in a classroom. How does that make me feel as a non-Christian? It's a great question. And JD handles it. He talks about, well, look, this is a majority Christian country. So we feel like we can put forward some of our beliefs, and it is something that is broadly acceptable to other religions. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't lie, honor thy mother and father. Nothing really that controversial about it. But there is this back and forth. So Joe Rogan is showing, I'm really going to get into it with you. And JD Vance accepts that. And he says, look, I know there may be different thoughts about that. And then JD was able to talk about his own times in his own life when he was agnostic or atheistic, and saying that, even during the times when I did not believe in God or I struggled with my faith, I still felt that knowing those things and seeing those things was probably a good thing. So that was really very interesting. It was a nice exchange, and Joe Rogan was showing, I'm going to push you. That this is fun. I am going to push you. I know you're the vice president of the United States, but that also requires you to respond to me, the people. And Joe Rogan positions himself as a representative of us, the people, and I appreciate that. Then what was interesting was there was something unexpected. So Joe Rogan started talking about the fact that maybe 20, 30 years ago, Biden had two brain surgeries, something which JD Vance did not know about. And to his credit, JD Vance, asked Joe, "What are you talking about? I don't know about the Biden brain surgeries." And so it was a nice moment for JD Vance, this very smart person, to say, "Oh, I don't know about that." And that makes JD Vance more human. So JD Vance didn't play it off or anything like that or attempt to cover it up, but was just authentic. I don't know about that. Because we all have holes in our knowledge. And so when you see somebody who's a public figure admit that they have a hole in their knowledge, well, that's really humanizing. And so that is also something that JD Vance did in spades throughout the entire interview. Then we moved into another controversial area. So notice what Joe Rogan did. So Joe Rogan had something challenging and then something unexpected, the Biden brain surgeries. So, and that was kind of like a funny little thing because Joe had challenged him with a 10 Commandments thing, but then he pulled it back by saying, "Oh, Biden had brain surgeries, and boy, he really didn't seem to be that with it when he was president." So then Joe goes on the attack again, and he brings up the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I thought, okay, this is where it's going to get interesting. And to JD's credit, again, he says, "Look, we have to own the fact that the rollout was terrible. And that was a huge mistake. That was a failure of the Trump administration." Perfect. This is something that we want to see from anybody in the public eye. Don't think you have to defend, but if there's something that's a mistake, you got to own up to it. And JD Vance clearly and unequivocally owned up to the fact that the rollout of the Epstein files was a big failure of the Trump administration. But then he kind of brought it back around and he said, okay, the rollout was a mistake. Did the Biden administration release any of this information? No, they didn't. The previous Trump administration was the one who arrested Epstein. And then JD Vance went back into the history and he said, who was the first person of any note who called out Jeffrey Epstein? And that was Donald Trump. Who was the one who threw Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago? That was Trump. So I think the real story about Epstein that hasn't been said by anybody is that Epstein was protected by some very powerful forces. And this was also interesting with what JD Vance did, which was JD Vance was saying, I'm kind of known as the conspiracy theorist in the Trump administration, because whenever one of these controversies comes up, I'm the one who wants to do a deep dive into it. So this is perfect. Could not have been done any better by JD Vance, because here's where the country is. We know that we've been lied to about a number of things. And so we're not telling our public officials that they have to believe what we believe. What we want, what we really demand from our public figures is when an issue comes up, you have to convince us that you have put in the time to give us an answer to that question. And so J.D. Vance did that. He said, I'm the one who was suspicious about things. That's really what he was saying by saying he's known as the conspiracy theorist. So that was great. And so he looks into it and he says, look, the real interesting time period for Jeffrey Epstein is a period from the 1990s until he's charged in approximately 2007 with that sex crime charge, the prostitution charge, soliciting prostitution charge in Florida. And he says, those records seem to have vanished. There's not a lot of good information that we get. And his suspicion is that that is where the real interesting information was. And it seems to have been have mysteriously vanished or been lost. So this is fantastic because it explains the terrible rollout. It takes responsibility for that terrible rollout of information, but it paints it a little bit differently. Now, I'm working on a new book, Book of Secrets, which you can see right here. So, Book of Secrets, I take a deep dive into the Jeffrey Epstein case. And one of the things that I came across is that one of the big problems is that going through the 6 million documents in the Epstein files required approximately 500 lawyers at the Department of Justice, which was pretty much their full capacity. So those 500 lawyers weren't doing any other work. They were focusing on getting the Epstein files ready for release. So that's another thing. So J.D. Vance had deftly handled the 10 Commandments issue. He deftly handled the Jeffrey Epstein problem. Then we turn to Iran. Now, the reports are that J.D. Vance was not enthusiastic about going into Iran, that this was really driven by Trump. And to J.D.'s credit, he acknowledged that, yeah, he's one of the people who was more cautious about it. But he said that decision is the president's, and there are areas of agreement that I have, which is that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon and that Iran cannot be allowed to threaten its neighbors. And JD is leading the negotiations to try and bring about a solution to that problem. So it really sets him up as having a little bit of distance from Donald Trump, which is fine. You know, on these big issues, we should not have a monolithic block of opinion, because some days one course of action will seem like the right one. On a different day, a different course of action might seem better. So what JD is signaling is that Trump is not a dictator because he's comfortable with having people who have different opinions. And it's even fine to say that publicly because we don't know how this is going to go. So what it's setting up is this wonderful dynamic that JD Vance is allowed to be an individual human being. Notice how different this is from what Kamala Harris did in the 2024 election. When Kamala Harris was asked on The View whether there was anything different she would have done from Biden, she said, I can't think of anything, which, I'm sorry, is not the sign of a thinking person. Even if somebody does everything totally right, I know between me and my wife, you know, we're both great people and everything. We may see things a little bit differently. That's fine. but you just got to be honest. And, that doesn't mean you can't say, hey, 6 months down the road, wow, this really worked out great. I guess I was wrong. Or, oh, wow, my approach didn't work at all. That's fine. That's all we ask of human beings. And what JD Vance was doing in that situation is he was showing, I'm there. I'm an intelligent human being. Sometimes I agree 100%. Sometimes I'm going to agree 70%. But he did it all in a way which was not off-putting. You didn't feel like he was there to sabotage Trump. He was there to support it. He did a great job. That's what we want. We don't know the answers to things. Even if we had all the information that the president has, that still doesn't mean that necessarily we're going to make the right decision every time. Let's just be grown-ups about how difficult it is to be the leader of a country. You often don't know what the right course of action is, and you're making your best guess. That's all we can say. Okay, moving on. And so here is Rogan having done, an amazing set of questions to JD Vance, some of them quite pointed. And then they moved on to aliens, and they had quite a long talk about aliens. And what was interesting was that Joe Rogan was questioning what JD Vance had said about aliens possibly being demons. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting because it's something that they both have an interest in, but there's a significant difference of opinion. And I was wondering, okay, how's JD Vance going to handle that? Because if you just say aliens are likely demons, well, that makes you kind of look like a Christian fundamentalist, and that's going to turn a lot of people off. And JD's response was very nuanced. And what he said is, I didn't say they were demons. I said whether they are helpful to us or harmful to us, what is the essential difference between them being angels or demons? Because maybe they're so far advanced from us, not just technologically, but maybe psychologically, intellectually, I don't know. There may be no reasonable kind of difference or significant difference between looking at them as angels or demons or just negative or positive advanced beings. And I thought that was really interesting. That's a very sophisticated look at the question of aliens and this question of if these aliens have been around for a long time. Over that period of time, have ancient civilizations misidentified some of these encounters as being angelic or demonic? I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that anybody on the planet really knows the answer to that, but that seems like a significant and a reasonable question. All right. The other big topic that they discussed was the recent victory in several races of socialist candidates. And again, JD Vance showed himself to be an all-tool player because it's not enough for any politician to simply oppose a current trend, but to suggest what should be done differently. And so JD started out by telling a story about getting together for dinner with some of his wife's friends who grew up in San Diego, then being a couple years younger than JD and his wife, Usha, and how difficult it was for them, despite the fact that they had well-paying jobs, to buy their first home. And what JD was saying is that there really isn't much that previous administrations have done to attacked the fact that 40 or 50 years ago, couples in their 20s could look forward to buying a home, but now it seems to be the average age at which somebody purchases their first home is in their early 40s. And he said, if we don't have a path for young people to get a home at a reasonable age, then they're going to be attracted by socialism. And we just have to admit that. Again, a real sophisticated look at the situation. Also, Joe Rogan talked about the Israel question and whether Israel was behind our current situation with Iran. Well, JD pushed back a lot on that, but then in his very sophisticated, very moderate way, he talked about the fact that Israel ain't doing so well in US public opinion. The American public does not like what's going on in Gaza. They think that Israel is attempting to significantly influence our elections and our foreign policy. And JD did not refute that argument. His argument instead was that, well, many foreign governments try to influence the United States, Israel being one of them. Now, the question is whether that influence is appropriate or whether it's too much. And JD was saying, well, we got to talk about that. And he used this expression. And this is another kind of like sign to me that JD is an all-tool player. So an all-tool player will give you expressions like a good attorney during a trial that you will start to use. So remember, JD called himself a conspiracy theorist. That's kind of like his nickname in the administration, especially when it comes up like about the Epstein files. And he did another thing when he was talking about Israeli influence. He called himself a reasonable moderate. Think about that. Every person wants to think of themselves as reasonable. It's like good looking. You know, we all want to think we're good looking. We all want to think we're reasonable. None of us, or few of us, want to think of ourselves as zealots. So he did that. And that was another mark to me that JD Vance is an all-tool player. So let's think about all of the great things that JD displayed in that 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan. He showed you that he's smart because he'll have a sophisticated point of view. Yes, he is a very strong Christian, but he's open to other arguments. He's open to wisdom from other faiths. He's relatable, meaning that he's not going to pretend to be a know-it-all. He's not going to pretend that he knows about Biden's brain surgeries when he doesn't. And he'll give you his point of view, and he'll accept that there are different points of view. I mean, being able to say that you had a different opinion than Trump in the view of the left means that Trump is going to attack you. Well, JD just showed that no. Yes, I was more skeptical about going into Iran than the president was, but we have broad areas of disagreement. So all of these things go to show that JD Vance is an all-tool player and is going to be quite difficult to beat in 2028 if he chooses to run for president. There's another thing about JD Vance that I don't think is fully appreciated. I'm a believer that one of the best predictors of success for a politician is whether they can write a popular book. And let me talk about the last three presidents. So, Barack Obama wrote an amazing book called Dreams from My Father. Now, there's some question whether Radical Bill Ayers helped him write it, but aside from that, it's a great book. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it because it's a story of one man coming to terms with who he is, a child abandoned by his father, and what all of that meant, and what it meant growing up in America as a biracial young man. It is one of the best pieces of writing, I think, in the past 50 years. Okay, so I think that set Barack Obama up to be a very successful politician. With Donald Trump, he did The Art of the Deal. Now, again, there's questions who really wrote it, but there's no doubt over the fact that that was Trump's philosophy. And he's written a number of other books, and we know about his time as a reality TV star. He had time in the spotlight. It really helped him be a good politician. What you don't realize about J.D. Vance is J.D. Vance is in the mold of Barack Obama and Donald Trump in having written a very successful book, Hillbilly Elegy. Now, you may have seen the movie with Glenn Close. It's also great, directed by Ron Howard, story about growing up poor in Appalachia, very similar in many ways to, Barack Obama growing up in a difficult family situation. But I want to talk about how unique it is that J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy. And let me just give you some examples. So I mentioned Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. How many books did he sell? So if you go onto Amazon, there's about 10,000 Amazon reviews for Dreams from My Father. Now, I think that was published a little bit before Amazon really got big, but you can think that's pretty good. So the book that I've written that has the most reviews, Plague of Corruption, has just a little under 9,000 Amazon reviews. So you kind of get that, and Plague of Corruption sold about 200,000 copies. Well, Hillbilly, and so what you can kind of do is for every Amazon review, just think, it's around 25 books sold per Amazon review. Well, Hillbilly Elegy had 125,000 reviews. That is remarkable. So that's well over 2 million books sold. So J.D. Vance can write and he can talk in a way that brings people forward. Now, how do I know that J.D. Vance cast a spell on Joe Rogan? Here's one of the keys of communication. It's something I use as a writer. What I do as a writer is I get people to talk to me. I'm not a big talker, despite what you may think from this show. I get people to talk to me. This is a really important point. If you can get somebody else to talk to you, and they say things like, these are things I haven't told anybody before. What's happening in their brain is they trust you enough to share their inner thoughts. By them sharing their inner thoughts, they are expressing their trust and their like for you. If somebody tells you secrets or goes on, what they're showing you is how much they trust you. This is something that as you got to the end of the interview, it seemed like Joe Rogan was expressing his deeply held beliefs to JD Vance. You only do that to somebody from whom you get a good feeling. So Joe Rogan was showing a lot about Joe Rogan in the interview with JD Vance. Why? Because JD Vance, because of him being smart, relatable, approachable, willing to admit that there are things that he does not know, brought Joe Rogan forward. Here's what Joe Rogan is saying behind the scenes about JD Vance. Behind the scenes, and maybe he'll say this in his show, is I just love JD Vance. JD Vance is great. Now, JD Vance didn't say he agreed with everything that Joe Rogan said, but he showed respect to Joe Rogan. And you show respect by listening and not interrupting somebody, and then saying, all right, I understand you say this. Here's my perspective. That's what JD Vance did consistently. This is JD Vance's operating system. It's dynamite. Everybody is wondering what's going to happen when Trump leaves the scene, because Trump is a master at sucking up all the oxygen in the room. And so, are we going to have another Trump? No, because people will be sick of that. What they're going to love is JD Vance. They're going to love that person who sits back, listens, and then responds. And everybody's going to say, oh my God, this is so different than Trump. But here's the rub. JD Vance is the continuation of Donald Trump, just with a little different packaging. So all the good things that you like about Trump are going to continue with JD Vance. It's just going to be a little bit softer, but the same things are going to be done. So mark my words, JD Vance is a superstar. You just may not realize it yet. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully this is not the best part of your day. Hopefully the best part of your day is talking to the people in your life, not some guy on the internet. Thank you and have a great day.